Hello, I'm George Liston, CA. Welcome to Dialogue, a program that explores the world of ideas and issues in international affairs, history, and culture. Despite the placid imagery with which we comfort ourselves, old age is, for many Americans, a nightmare. A hellish experience of abuse, often terminating in a lonely, painful death, devoid of comfort, care, or dignity. The specter of elder abuse stalks the land like a silent scandal, affecting several million older citizens at their most vulnerable time of life, but thus far failing to gain the definitive political response it cries out for. An effective solution to the problem of elder abuse must be seen as, fundamentally, an act of justice for those whose later years deserve the protections afforded by a respectful society. My guest is Marie-Therese Connolly, a fellow of the Woodrow Wilson Center and former coordinator of the Elder Justice and Nursing Home Initiative of the United States Department of Justice. Marie-Therese, welcome to Dialogue.
Thank you so much.
It's wonderful to have you here. The topic is extremely important, although somewhat grim, obviously, and I think part of that owes to the shock to the system that we experience when we think of elders being treated in this way. It doesn't comport with our image of the golden years and the kind of imagery we associate with older people. So perhaps as a starting point, Marie-Therese, you could help us by giving us an insight into how extensive this is. Just how large a problem is this?
Well, one of the problems actually is that we don't know because we haven't collected the data to know exactly how large an issue it is, which is some indication of the fact that the issue hasn't risen to a national consciousness, into the national consciousness to the extent that there is a demand for quantifying it. That said, the studies that have been done give a pretty broad range. Somewhere between 500,000 and 5 million older Americans are victimized each year, either by abuse, neglect, or financial exploitation.
Those studies originate where, Marie-Therese?
Well, the Administration on Aging has done some, and academics, or has sponsored some. The National Institute on Justice has funded some pilot data to try and get a handle on the incidence and prevalence. The National Institute on Aging, which is part of NIH, has funded also some pilot data or pilot studies. There are academics at Cornell, the University of California, all over the country who are doing some work on this issue, and the Institute, the National Research Council, National Academy of Sciences, which was charged with setting out a research agenda, basically said we don't know enough yet to set a research agenda.
They may not know enough yet, but it's encouraging that they are so active in this, and those are pretty respectable organizations and institutions. One of the things I suspect, and maybe you can correct this, is if one case is too many, but if you're talking about 500,000 to 5 million, that kind of magnitude suggests that it may be a tip of the iceberg sort of number.
Absolutely.
That a lot, beneath that just is not known about, but can be extrapolated from
Absolutely, and you're exactly right in using the tip of the iceberg analogy, because that is precisely what is thought by the experts. And the one study that we have indicates that about 84% of cases go unreported and unrecognized. And so we're only seeing literally the tip of the iceberg.
Wow.
And that's probably even low. Other estimates are that what is unseen is an even greater percentage. And there are many reasons for it going unreported. Often it happens in the family. Often the person who might report doesn't have the capacity to report, or is very ashamed, or is scared of retribution by whoever the caregiver is. And so there are many reasons that it goes unseen. And also, elder abuse is considered to be sort of where child abuse was about 40 years ago, and domestic violence was about 20 years ago, which is to say, oh, it's a family problem. We don't really talk about that. Yeah,
it's what I call the swept under the rug phenomena, which was, and it's good to remember that child abuse and domestic violence were issues very much like that in our recent history. To what extent, even with the tip of the iceberg as being the only part we can be fairly certain of, but really knowing that there's a lot more behind that, to what extent does it correlate with things like income, class, or is it so pervasive that it's literally across the board?
What the current thinking is on that is that it's certainly across the board, but what we would consider risk factors are probably risk factors for elder abuse as well: poverty, disability, both physical disability and capacity, increasing dementia, and increasing old age. We know that the fastest growing segment of the population, those who are 85 and older, who are also called the oldest old, are also at greatest risk.
Right.
And so we do know some things about who's at more risk than others.
So in a sense, I guess what we do know is that it exists everywhere, but it can be perhaps exacerbated by some of these factors. For example, where resources are limited and poverty exists, there we may find some acute cases of this as well, for those reasons.
And you know, for very pragmatic kinds of reasons. In fact, a case, I was talking yesterday to a victim advocate in Florida who had worked with a woman who was 96 years old. And when she was in her late 80s, she had lived with a son who was unable to take care of her anymore because he was in his late 60s and was not in great health. So she went to a nursing home and she hated it. And she wanted more than anything to get out of that nursing home. So she left and she went to move in with her grandson and his wife in their trailer home. And and at that point she was in her 90s, and she lived there for some years, and she did most of the cooking, she did much of the cleaning, she contributed much of her Social Security check to the household or would make loans to them. And then at one point, her granddaughter-in-law was in the hospital, and her grandson came home, and he raped his grandmother brutally, and beat her and dragged her out to the shed to where he got his beer, and came back in. He raped her several times, and then he fell asleep, and she called 911, and it was actually one of the few cases that we have where there was a law enforcement intervention and there was a prosecution and he was convicted.
You know, I appreciate that story, grim as it is. And in fact, we're going to talk about this book you're writing, which brings forth many case stories. But well, you know, one thing that comes out from a story like that, Marie-Therese, is on the side of the abusers, the people who do this, something that awful suggests mental illness and instability, stress factors, and other things in the society generally also influencing this. I mean, there are victims, and that's who we're talking about and focusing on. But those who are victimizing them probably have their own problems in deep-seated ways.
I think that's exactly right. And Adult Protective Services, which is the analog to Child Protective Services, they in most states are working for people who are usually 18 and older, although sometimes only elders, say that if you look at most cases, it's often adult sons, sometimes adult daughters with either mental illness or substance abuse problems who are most often the abusers.
Right.
Now that's anecdotal, but it's based on a long foundation of experience by the people who are really on the front lines.
That's very helpful. And of course, the bottom line is, though, as with children, it's the most vulnerable, the aged or the children who are the likely victims of this kind of pathology. How has this affected, Marie-Therese? You know, one of the ironies in this subject is we're increasingly an aging society.
That's right.
You know, and dramatically so. And of course, there's this baby boomer age invasion just on the cusp of happening here. How does that factor into this?
The first baby boomer just filed for Social Security last month, I believe.
That's right.
Yeah, I mean, the older population is going to double between 2000 and 2030, and the oldest old, who we were talking about earlier, are the most rapidly growing. There were 4 million 85 and older in 2000. There'll be about 18 million in 2025, and about 31 million, based on current estimates, in 2050. So it's a very rapidly aging group, and the problem is going to get worse. I mean, we need to start to look at it. And you just had mentioned the mental illness or mental health issues, and then substance abuse issues. Those are also the children who often either end up coming back to live at home because they can't make it on the outside, or end up then being a putative caregiver.
Right.
How good that care is often questionable, but often a parent is going to feel very guilty and very disappointed in how that child's life has evolved, and therefore also not want to report whatever abuse is going on, creating these very complex, both psychological, emotional, and physical problems.
This is very true, and as I listen to you, I get the sense it's really kind of a mirror of multiple pathologies and problems in our society playing out, all in sort of an awful kind of way in many cases.
That's right. Yeah. Ironically, elder abuse has been largely overlooked in the family violence field, even though when you look at these cases, when you look at a case of elder abuse and look through the family chain, often you'll see other kinds of abuse and neglect, either domestic violence or child abuse, or either the perpetrator or the victim were a victim once before themselves. And so it's one of the problems in the family violence field, I think, that we're going to have to address is that elder abuse needs to be at the table because because of the demographics and because we would like to think of ourselves as a civilized society.
Well, one forthcoming contribution to our understanding of this problem is going to be the book you're working on, which is, at least at this point, its working title is No Place for Sissies, which is a direct quote of Betty Davis that I very much like. But as a quote, I like it, and I certainly like the idea of this book. And it strikes me that when you think of No Place for Sissies, or the idea, it has more than one meaning that's relevant. For example, no place for sissies because this can be such a hellish experience for people who are victimized by old age abuse. But also because the problem, Marie-Therese, the solutions have to be very sensitive. For example, that 96-year-old woman you mentioned a few moments ago, that's an honorable age, obviously. And people who reach that age are often very proud of their independence and their autonomy. And so it seems to me, even when you define who's in this category and what to do about them, there has to be a great deal of sensitivity about what's really going on. I mean, you can't just, it seems to me that, you need solutions that embrace a lot of people, but there has to be this kind of targeted interest in each one.
That's exactly right. And one of the reasons it's a very complex field is because of the autonomy and independence issues. Older people are not children in that they have all of their civil rights and freedoms intact unless they're adjudicated to not have capacity, and then a whole different set of systems come into play. But that makes it a very difficult issue in terms of where is the line where you impose protection, essentially? And where do you say, no, it's okay for this woman to make a decision to cook and clean for a grandson at age 96? And driving is another example of that.
That's a great example.
Or living alone. A lot of older people who are beginning to experience some dementia really want to continue driving, want to live alone, and yet perhaps they're putting themselves and possibly others at risk. And so what do families and loved ones and societies do responsibly? Is it an imposition? Are you patronizing them, or are you looking out for their safety? And it's, there's an example of, I think that I had used in my proposal about the son who had a mother who was in the early stages of dementia who wanted to take a driving trip with her boyfriend to a condo that may or may not have existed halfway across the country. And what does a responsible son or daughter do under those circumstances? Do you say, no, absolutely not?
May I say that story, and the way you pose it right now, say, well, what is the answer to that? The answer is a very particular one and not as easy to get at. But one of the strengths of the forthcoming book, I think, will be these case studies that make this a very vivid kind of individual experience for the reader.
I hope so. I mean, one of the complicating factors I think about elder abuse, and one of the reasons it hasn't really risen into our national consciousness, is because it doesn't have a national identity. It's an amalgamation of a number of different phenomena that you don't necessarily think of in the same thought or group or issue. For example, it can be the older man in a nursing home or assisted living facility who isn't getting the help eating that he needs and therefore is starving to death, literally. Or it can be the older woman living at home who's so happy to get those calls from the nice person in Canada who says that she's won sweepstakes and all she has to do is send in a little bit of tax money to get the sweepstakes earning.
Well, I'm glad you're touching on this, because I see it as a kind of a perverse counterpane, if you will, or or interweaving of both definitions and locales. For example, we're talking about mistreatment of elders. Well, that's abuse or neglect or neglect of both kinds, or exploitation. You know, there's several paths to it happening. And then there are several locales, obviously, within an institution. And some of the most egregious cases are in nursing homes, I think you point out, or in families. It can happen, or even when they're living alone.
That's right. Right, it is. It makes it a more complicated issue to wrap our minds around because, as you say, it can happen in a facility, it can happen at home. And in terms of facilities, we know a lot more about what goes on in nursing homes. We know much less about what's going on in assisted living facilities, in board and care facilities, in congregate living facilities. Why is that?
Because they're newer, or we just
They're newer. They are subject to much less oversight and regulation, and so we just don't know. We don't have any numbers. Where we do have numbers, the numbers are more bleak than we would hope as our society is aging. For example, nursing homes, we know that approximately 50 to 90% are understaffed at levels that result in harm to residents. And those are pretty dramatic numbers.
Yeah. You know, one category of numbers, Marie-Therese, that probably most useful is also among the most tragic, and that would be forensic. Do your studies rely a lot on that? For example, the most awful cases hit the front pages of newspapers where someone has gone, a staff member all too often in a nursing home, has begun to do serial things to patients and such. Is the collection of that data extensive enough and helpful enough to understanding the range of the problem?
No, we're just at the very, very bottom of the mountain in terms of having the forensic data we need in order to identify cases. And really it's about detection. It's about being able to recognize when something bad is going on. And I believe maybe one of the cases you were alluding to earlier about a staff member, sort of an angel of death or a psycho, depending on one's definition, is the example of Charles Cullen, who was a nurse who worked at numerous nursing homes and hospitals across New Jersey and Pennsylvania, and killed some 37 to 40 people over the course of 15 years, and nobody asked questions. People were dying unexpectedly, and one of the insidious things in terms of this issue is that older people die in greater numbers than younger people, and so when older people die, we don't ask questions, and so suspicious deaths often go unrecognized because no one ever asked questions or looked at the body or did any sort of review.
Against all of that, is it possible for you to point to for example, a state or any other entity for that matter, that's doing if not a model, at least a creditable job that's worthy of some emulation on these
things? There's some very interesting studies going on, and actually one of the things that I had the privilege of doing at the Department of Justice was to launch a research program, really, that now has funded some very interesting research, much of which is still ongoing. In the state of Arkansas, there's an enterprising coroner named Mark Malcolm who nudged the state legislature to pass a law that required death investigations of all nursing home deaths. And the result of that was that they actually started looking at why people died. Now, Mark has said that anecdotally he believes that that's resulted in an improvement in the care in nursing homes, just the very scrutiny of the deaths. He was seeing fewer large pressure sores and fewer suspicious deaths. And that's an issue that's still being studied. Related to that, we funded the University of California, Irvine, which has a fabulous program that we might talk about a little bit more. But they did a study to look at bruising in elders, and they literally went to an old age living community and asked the folks who had signed up for the study to get undressed once a day and looked at all the bruises and asked them if they remembered how they had gotten those bruises. And by and large, the people did not remember how they had gotten the bruises. 90% of the bruises were on the extremities and 10% were on the torso. There were no bruises that were reported to have occurred accidentally on the head, neck, genitalia, and so forth. So even that piece of research tells us something very important, which is if you see a bruise in one of the locations other than the head, extremities, or the torso, ask questions. Do follow up. Review.
Well, to talk a little bit more about that right now, does something like that California methodology get replicated as a result of it coming to the attention of the department?
Well, there are other. That study was published in the Journal of the American Geriatric Society, and so now when a physician is examining a patient or an adult protective services worker is meeting with a client, they know that if there are bruises in unlikely uncommon locations, that they should be asking more questions and saying, this could be questionable. We need to look into this further to establish how this happened and whether this person is at risk. Based on that study, also, the department funded a follow-up study to look at inflicted bruising as opposed to accidental bruising, to say, okay, how do bruises that we know were inflicted by one person on another differ from accidental bruises? And then also the department funded another study looking at pressure sores.
Exactly. When you think of all these studies, and this is absolutely fundamentally important information being gathered, it reminds me of something else that you were very vitally connected with, which I think might be the kind of arena to make the best use of this thing, and that's the Elder Justice Act, and a piece of legislation that would, among other things, make the gathering and study and implementation of this kind of information mandatory, really, across the country. I want you to tell us a bit about this. I know that it's had a once and future life. It has come up as legislation, proposed legislation in 2003. Didn't fully make it at that point, but maybe coming back again. What does it provide for?
The Elder Justice Act is the first comprehensive federal legislation to address elder abuse, and it really comes at it from a multidisciplinary perspective, which experts in the field concur is the only way to address the issue, because it is inherently a medical and healthcare issue, it's a legal issue, and it's a social services issue. And so the Elder Justice Act would basically enhance the ability of the healthcare system, the legal system, and the social services systems to address this issue better.
To gather information, to define best practices, and then to put them into effect?
Correct. Both on the medical side of the equation, to increase the number of geriatricians. Right now we have about 9,000 geriatricians. We need about 30,000. And academic geriatricians are particularly rare beast, which results in a paucity of research.
Right.
So it would increase the number of geriatricians. It would enhance research. It would develop centers of excellence, which would be areas to really foster additional research and knowledge that in turn would be disseminated to the field. Right. So that's the healthcare piece, and also to help folks on the front line better understand what kinds of medical assistance is needed.
You know, I mean, just briefly put, Marie-Therese, by way of reaction, that sounds admirable. Why did it not succeed as legislation in your estimation the first time? And what do you think its chances? It would seem to me to be at least a major part of the answer to much of this, if not all of it.
It's really a mystery to me. You know, I went in with great delusions thinking, oh, this will pass immediately. It's obviously very compelling. The bill was quite uncontroversial, and the more controversial provisions have since been stripped out of it. And I think it goes back to the reason that I'm at the Wilson Center and want to write this book so much, which is that it is not an issue that resonates in the hearts and minds of the American public as a coherent issue that we can do something about. When folks who work on domestic violence issues or diabetes issues or other kinds of issues want to do advocacy in Congress, they can lift up a phone or send a few emails, and there will be a flood of tens, if not hundreds of thousands of emails converging on the Capitol. The elder abuse field is not there yet. It cannot do that, and it's not. So the advocacy piece really is still, while there are some fabulous people working on advocacy, it has not yet occurred.
This is rich. I really appreciate this, and I think this is extremely important, these statements you're making right now, Marie-Therese, on this. And two questions occur to me immediately. One is in terms of advocacy, and there are many other extremely important causes, and this is not in opposition to any of them. It's just we need people for this. I would think, for example, of AARP or other major organizations taking this up with cudgels. That's not happening, or in your opinion?
It hasn't happened yet, because I think if it had happened, the Elder Justice Act would be law today. Because it was introduced in 2003, it was introduced again in 2005, again in 2007, and it has not been enacted yet. And I think that as I said, I think there needs to be pressure from people whose lives are affected by elder abuse, and that those people number in the many millions.
And will number in the many millions more.
That's correct.
As we're seeing. The second question that occurred to me, even in a brief response, is this one. To what extent do you think the, quote, youth culture mentality in our society, which has focused so much attention on looking young, staying young, being young, etc., at least psychologically, has kept us from understanding what age implies or what the needs of the aged really are?
You ask great questions. I think there are many discrete reasons that we can point to, but I think at the very bedrock of why we have not embraced this issue as an issue that matters to us, both where we live and where we put our advocacy efforts in our pocketbook, is because because of some fundamental, both a combination of ageism and denial. On the one hand, we are a youth culture, as you say, and we want to, none of us wants to imagine ourselves that 96-year-old woman who has a number of options, none of which are great. And we're not ready to embrace that, I think, on some level. And then, which is both the denial and the ageism pieces together. So I think once we are better at embracing our own aging and that of others, that we will, and the inevitability both of that and of the demographics, that we will do a better job recognizing this issue.
Well, Marie-Therese, let me just say in closing that I think your work is a great contribution to just that outcome. I look forward to the book under any title it forthcomes, and thank you so much for being with us today, and we'll have you back when the book is out.
It's a great privilege to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. And that's our program. We appreciate your comments, and you can reach us at dialogue@wilsoncenter.org. I'm George Liston, CA, and you've been watching Dialogue, a co-production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and MHZ Networks. Dialogue is also on the MHZ Worldview channel, which is available to public TV stations nationwide. For more information, go to www.mhzworldview.org. Please join us again right here next week, and thank you for watching this week. Marie-Therese, thank you.
Thank you so much.
That wasn't painful.